Hello guys and welcome back to this new video. Today we are going to talk about hallucinations. So just on a paid topic. Now, how do we define hallucination? We define that as the experience of something that in reality does not exist. And that is, even if we have an experience of it that is very clear and also very vivid. Now, our brain works as an intelligent guesswork, and what that means is, in the words of Oliver Sacks, that our brain just makes guesses on the reality, right? And this is so important because we can argue, in the words of Damasio, that we constantly hallucinate. In what sense do we hallucinate? We hallucinate because our brain constantly is forced to recognize our body. Now, our body is in two senses, right? So, our body is our body, and our body is also a medium for reality, right? Now, this is so important because everything is connected. It's no longer as it was thought in the past, disconnected but connected, and so we constantly recognize. On top of that, we recognize as a continuous form of perception, so in technical terms as a continuum. And that happens because otherwise we would end up having a bunch of still moments that we collect, but we cannot make sense of it, right? Therefore, to guarantee continuity, right, we tend to hallucinate. Now, the great deal of those hallucinations are benign, right? So we just hallucinate to guarantee continuity. We just hallucinate in a way that we can make sense of the experiences that we have. We hallucinate to guarantee ourselves a form of reality and therefore existence. As seen in experiences like the Charles Bonnet syndrome, right, or as seen in the syndrome of phantom limbs, what is so interesting and captivating about this is that the micro changes therefore get completely ignored. Now, those are micro changes that get ignored because our brain can kind of integrate them later on, make sense of the fact that they're very superficial, therefore negligible, and therefore can kind of ignore them. But this is so interesting because in this sense, in these terms, we can develop a sense of self, we can develop a narrative, we can develop a chronological series of events, right? So in 2004, an experiment was carried out. This experiment was performed by Maribeth, and the article of it is published in a journal called Neuro-Ophthalmology. They basically, what did they do? They picked a bunch of people. They put a blindfold on them so they couldn't see reality. The experiment was about basically depriving any sensual form of perception that you would normally have through vision, and people very quickly started hallucinating. Now, those type of hallucinations are totally described as benign, right? They mostly concern patterns of light. So basically, what happens here is that you deprive people from their vision, and then you see that they reproduce constantly their reality because that's in their mind, right? And so the body has the body as a medium still tries to penetrate some form of reality, and when you totally detach that kind of reality from the body, then your mind starts recreating it the way it knows it. Of course, introducing some sort of distortions, right? Like shiny glimmers of light, like angular distortions, etc., right? But 75% of the people that were perceptually deprived, they actually ended up hallucinating something small, something that wasn't disturbing, something that was totally benign, something that concerned mostly patterns of light. In particular, here we're talking about flashing lights, patterns, but also landscape and buildings. And basically, what that proves to us, as we have already mentioned, is that there is a scheme of perception that survives deprivation. So, even when we are deprived, especially when we are deprived, in order to keep reality as it is, as we know it, as an external element, for the body and the mind to work also as a form of educational guesswork on reality, our mind keeps on projecting out some sort of reality. Now, this also happens when we have migraines. When we have migraines, sometimes we hallucinate in terms of patterns of light that we might be able to see. And patterns of light can be geometrical patterns, like Clever has proved, and they could be manifested in terms of funnels, tunnels, cobwebs, lattices, and spirals. But besides that, we all need to wonder and we all need to ask ourselves what are the fundamental differences between this sort of hallucinations that are very benign, that have the purpose of providing some sort of reality. What is the difference, I was saying, between this type of hallucinations and other that are definitely perceived way more negatively? The general assumption though here is that even though some of those hallucinations might be perceived in a very negative terms, remains to be certain that a lot of those, right, and I cannot have a percentage because that again would depend on so many factors like diseases, like stress and whatnot, but so many of them can actually and are indeed actually very positive. Let's pick, for example, the night hag. So this is a condition that is determined by the fact that our body is in sleep paralysis, right? Now, there's a very good reason why we can't move when we sleep, because otherwise we become sleepwalking, possibly killing around people. No, I'm kidding. And it's not that all the sleepwalkers, they actually kill people, but there is that chance, as history has proven. But anyway, we are in sleep paralysis. We cannot move, so that we cannot go around and hurt ourselves or hurt other people. So we are motionless, right? But our brain is awake. So that determines some sort of like discrepancy, so that we are awake but trapped at the same time, and our brain catches that as discrepancy, catches that as a something wrong, and then hallucinates this idea that we are being trapped, that we cannot move when we want to move, because naturally when we wake up, the first thing that we want to do is get up, basically, right? Or our body tells us to get up. But hallucinations depend into the perception, positive or negative, depends a lot on the culture we are in. In Western cultures, in Western societies, hallucinations are somehow always connected to schizophrenia, somehow something to be constantly treated, somehow something completely negative, right? But in other cultures, it is totally normal to hallucinate. Also, to hallucinate the voice of that people, right? And so that gives you an understanding of how hallucinations vary a lot. But on top of that, I also want to add that auditory, especially auditory hallucinations, a lot of the times are actually positive. First of all, because I've experienced one, and later on I'm going to tell you, but in general, they are very positive because they are the symptom, the sign that we are under stress, and that basically our brain is telling us to slow down 1 second, do this, right? It's our subconscious that responds to the situation, to the stressful situation, and tells us what to do in that particular moment. For instance, auditory hallucinations are very common in climbers, right? The climbers of very high mountains, peaks, and whatnot, right? They experience a lot auditory hallucination because they often find themselves in dangerous position where they cannot really go back, and moving forward is difficult, right? And so the subconscious responds to that kind of situation, telling them, go ahead, don't look below you, don't look behind you, and things like that. Of course, we don't want to deny here by any mean that there can be actually very negative experiences of hallucinations, right? But here we're gonna ask ourselves another question first before addressing negative hallucinations. And that question is, how do hallucinations emerge? How are they created? How were they born in our brain? So basically, there is one main theory. This theory has to do with visual cortex overstimulation. Now, there are many proofs and many types of evidence that corroborate and some that disprove this sort of theory. Let's start with our first experiment. So we are talking about the experiment that's been carried out by Kepex and colleagues, right? This has happened in St. Louis at the University of Washington. And basically, Kepex induced hallucination-like experiences, right? The way to do that was through computer games, right? But he tested both human beings and also mice. And what happened? Was that they needed to recognize a specific sound in a very noisy background, right? So what happened was that, like when you are in a restaurant and you have to understand what that person in front of you is saying and what that person is talking about when you have a lot of background noise. So in that experiment, mice and human beings had to be able to discern sounds, even though the background was pretty noisy. And what happened was that men were able to recognize and they pressed a button, whereas mice moved their noses. And so this was particularly interesting because in paying attention in the task of picking up certain sounds and isolate them, that creates a lot of hallucination-like experiences. So this type of situations encourage us to experience hallucinations, right? There is a factor here that is very important, and that is how our sensory cortex works. To explain this, right, we have to think that in order to anticipate the sounds that we are trying to hear or that we are paying extreme attention to be able to hear properly, there is an increase of dopamine, an increase of this hormone that is known as dopamine in the region of the striatum. Now, this increase of dopamine also increases in turn the likelihood of experiencing an hallucination. This is so fascinating as a research because we have to compare it with other researchers and other research that have been carried out lately and that will try to argue for a different account on why we hallucinate. In this new research, we have to deal with only with mice. And specifically, what has been proved, contrary to the main theory that supports the idea of overstimulation of the sensory cortex. So, contrary to that, these mice that have been bombarded with hallucinogens, and specifically with one hallucinogen called DOI. In this Oregon research, it has been proved that they have slower transmissions in the so-called serotonin circuits, specifically in the 2A serotonin circuits, where timing changes and the transmissions become slower. And, and this is fascinating because on the one hand we have dopamine, right? And dopamine that is overly produced, and on the other hand we do have transmissions in the serotonin circuits that slow down, and so there's timing that changes, and kind of a contradictions in the way of in the timing in which the two circuits are organized. So this seems the perfect framework to start understanding how hallucinations happen and why we experience hallucinations. But there is one other element here that we want to stress, and that element is the contrast between frontal lobe and visual cortex. As we know, frontal lobe is responsible for regulating social behavior, and so it is responsible of our behaviors in a social environment. For instance, no swearing, just to make an example, a stupid example, no swearing in front of people we don't know very well. And a visual cortex is responsible for what we see. Now, what has been observed is that in phases, in moments of great stress, like for instance what could be mourning, just to make an example, what happens is that there is an alternation in terms of who controls what between frontal lobe and the visual cortex. Now, in moments of great stress, mourning, or any troubling moment that we experience, what happens is that frontal lobe gives way and allows visual cortex to be responsible or be more in charge, right? And that paves the way for hallucinations. Now, one important element here to consider, and a fundamental factor that has been proved to be a fundamental factor, is perception. And perception is relevant, but it has to be inscribed within the context. And the context here is provided by the culture we are living in. In other words, in Western cultures, the tendency to react and to perceive hallucinations is strongly negative. In other words, when we think about hallucinations, we connotate them immediately with a negative undertone, with a negative connotation. We think about schizophrenia and we think about, all the worst. We think we're freaking out, we think we are out of our minds. Whereas in other cultures, and I'm referring to more Asian cultures or African cultures, hallucinations are perceived sometimes as totally normal, right? As a form of communication of spirits, and that allows people that experience hallucination to live this as almost a gift, as much of a gift that could be considered. And anyway, this is so important because a variation in perception is absolutely crucial here in our own experience of hallucinations. With that being said, though, I do want to say that I have experienced, as I mentioned earlier, an hallucination myself. I was in London, and I remember hearing the voice of my sister. I turned around and answered, except obviously my sister wasn't even there. She was in a completely different country, so that made me think, to be honest. But with that being said, I do want to remind you to take very good care of yourself at any point in time, not to be overwhelmed with stress, because stress in my case was the crucial factor, the factor that led me to experience that. And I want to remind you guys of the total um, benevolence of hallucinations at times. But comment below, let me know what you think, let me know if you have experienced any. We'll talk next time with a new episode, and don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Bye bye.